And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode's into the fascinating and often misunderstood philosophy of panpsychism, a perspective that challenges conventional views of consciousness by suggesting it is a fundamental feature of the universe. Rather than offering a polemical defense or outright dismissal, this episode takes a nuanced and balanced approach to exploring panpsychism's claims. We trace the history of the idea from its ancient philosophical roots to its contemporary revival and examine how it provides an alternative to the limitations of materialist and dualist theories of mind. The episode also considers prominent objections, such as the combination problem, while reflecting on the broader implications for ethics, science, and metaphysics. Whether you are a seasoned philosophy enthusiast or a curious listener encountering panpsychism for the first time, this episode offers a thoughtful and accessible look at one of the most intriguing and controversial theories in the philosophy of mind. For further reading and ways to support us, visit the Deeper Thinking podcast at podbean.com. Let's dive in. Imagine for a moment the experience of seeing the deep crimson of a setting sun, the feeling of warmth on your skin, or the taste of a perfectly brewed cup of coffee. These are all facets of consciousness, the intimate, subjective reality that defines our waking lives. Yet, despite the vast advances in neuroscience and cognitive science, the fundamental question remains: why does conscious experience exist at all? This question, known as the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers, exposes a profound mystery. The physical sciences excel at explaining mechanisms, how neurons fire, how the brain processes sensory inputs, and how memories are formed. But they remain silent on the deeper question: why does it feel like something to be you? Materialist and dualist approaches have traditionally sought to answer this question in one of two ways. The materialist claims that consciousness is nothing more than neural activity reducible to biochemical processes. The dualist, following Descartes, maintains that consciousness is an entirely separate non-physical substance, a soul distinct from the material world. But what if both views are mistaken? Enter panpsychism, a radical yet increasingly popular alternative that suggests consciousness is not an emergent property of complex brain sperms, but rather a fundamental feature of the universe itself. According to panpsychists, just as mass and charge are intrinsic properties of matter, so too is some form of consciousness, albeit in vastly simpler forms at fundamental levels of reality. This idea has gained traction among contemporary philosophers, including Philip Goff, one of the foremost advocates of panpsychism today. Goff argues that the assumption that matter is entirely devoid of experience is unwarranted. Instead, he proposes that elementary particles, electrons, quarks, might possess rudimentary forms of awareness, which, when arranged in complex configurations, give rise to the rich tapestry of human consciousness. This view does not imply that chairs, rocks, or tables are conscious, but rather that the building blocks of reality contain the seeds of consciousness. However, panpsychism remains highly controversial. Critics, such as Tim Crane, dismiss it as an unnecessary metaphysical speculation that merely shifts the problem rather than solving it. Others, like Joanna Liedenhag, question whether panpsychism can truly differentiate itself from religious or mystical conceptions of consciousness. And yet, as the failures of materialist and dualist explanations persist, panpsychism is being taken more seriously than ever. In this essay, we will trace the intellectual journey of panpsychism, examining its philosophical roots, the challenges it faces, and the ways in which it could reshape our understanding of consciousness. Could panpsychism be the long-awaited paradigm shift in philosophy of mind, or is it merely another speculative detour? Let's dive in. Panpsychism presents itself as a compelling alternative to the dominant views on consciousness. But what does it actually entail? At its core, panpsychism holds that consciousness is not exclusive to complex biological systems like human brains, but instead exists as a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. It does not necessarily mean that everything is conscious in the way that humans or animals are, but rather that the fundamental constituents of reality, perhaps elementary particles or fields, possess some form of rudimentary awareness. This approach challenges the traditional assumption that consciousness emerges only at a particular threshold of biological complexity, and instead suggests that it is an intrinsic aspect of existence itself. One of the defining aspects of panpsychism is that it offers a way to bridge the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. If consciousness is already present, even in the simplest building blocks of reality, then it need not be produced by the brain, but instead combined and structured in a way that results in the rich unified experiences that characterize human consciousness. This notion stands in stark contrast to materialist accounts, which struggle to explain how non-conscious matter can generate subjective experience, and dualist accounts which posit an ontological gap between mind and matter that seems difficult to reconcile with our scientific understanding of the world. Philip Goff, one of the leading contemporary defenders of panpsychism, describes it as an attempt to naturalize consciousness without reducing it to mere neural computation. He argues that modern science, while extraordinarily successful in explaining the quantitative structure of reality, has left out the qualitative dimension, the raw feel of experience, the redness of red, the sharpness of pain. According to Goff, physics tells us what matter does but remains silent on what matter is. By introducing consciousness as a fundamental component of the universe, panpsychism fills this explanatory void while preserving scientific coherence. Despite its intuitive appeal, panpsychism faces serious philosophical challenges. One of the most significant is known as the combination problem. If the fundamental units of reality possess simple forms of consciousness, how do these micro-consciousnesses combine to form the unified, complex experiences of human beings? Just as a collection of neurons firing in a particular pattern results in a single cohesive perception rather than a fragmented one, panpsychists must explain how many discrete conscious entities could come together to produce an overarching, unified subjectivity. This remains an open problem, and critics argue that unless a convincing answer is provided, panpsychism risks being no more explanatory than the materialist views it seeks to replace. Nevertheless, interest in panpsychism continues to grow. Whether seen as a promising new paradigm or an intriguing philosophical dead end, it has reignited debates about the fundamental nature of consciousness and forced a reconsideration of long-standing assumptions in both philosophy and science. The idea that consciousness is fundamental to the universe challenges centuries of philosophical tradition, yet it is not without precedent. Many ancient and pre-modern thinkers entertained ideas remarkably similar to panpsychism, even if they lacked the precise conceptual framework used today. Tracing the historical lineage of this idea reveals how thinkers from different eras grappled with the problem of consciousness and whether it could be understood as an intrinsic feature of reality rather than an anomalous product of biological complexity. The origins of panpsychist thought can be traced back to the pre-Socratic philosophers of ancient Greece. Thales, often considered the first philosopher in the Western tradition, famously declared that everything is full of gods, which some scholars interpret as an early form of panpsychism. While his claim was framed in mystical terms, it suggested that the natural world was suffused with some kind of animating principle. Similarly, Heraclitus proposed that fire was the fundamental substance of the universe, a notion that some have linked to a proto-panpsychist worldview in which reality itself is imbued with an active living essence. Plato, too, entertained ideas that resonate with panpsychism. In the Timaeus, he describes the cosmos as a living entity with a world soul, a concept that suggests a kind of universal consciousness. While Plato's metaphysics is not identical to modern panpsychism, his vision of a cosmos pervaded by intelligence provided an early model for thinking about mind as an inherent feature of the universe rather than an isolated phenomenon confined to humans and animals. This idea was later developed in the Neoplatonic tradition, particularly in the work of Plotinus, who saw all things as participating in a hierarchy of being emanating from a singular source of consciousness. A major shift occurred in the 17th century with the advent of mechanistic physics, particularly in the work of Galileo and Descartes. Galileo famously argued that the natural world should be understood in purely quantitative terms, reducing matter to mathematical properties such as extension, motion, and mass. This view deliberately stripped nature of qualitative aspects like colour, taste, and sound, relegating them to the realm of subjective perception rather than external reality. Descartes took this mechanistic vision further by sharply dividing the world into two distinct substances, res extensa, extended matter, and res cogitans, thinking substance. In doing so, he established the foundations of modern dualism, in which mind and matter are fundamentally different in kind. Panpsychism, in contrast, seeks to dissolve this stark division by arguing that mind and matter are not separate substances, but rather different aspects of the same fundamental reality. Instead of reducing consciousness to physical processes or positing a supernatural soul, panpsychism suggests that consciousness is already present at the most basic level of existence. This radical reconceptualization offers a way to reunite the world of subjective experience with the world of physical science, an ambitious goal that has both captivated and confounded philosophers for centuries. The modern resurgence of panpsychism can be attributed in large part to the limitations of both materialist and dualist explanations of consciousness. While materialism, the dominant paradigm in contemporary philosophy of mind, claims that consciousness arises solely from neural processes, it has struggled to explain how subjective experience, what it is like to feel pain, see red, or remember a childhood moment, emerges from purely physical interactions. This is the essence of the hard problem of consciousness, as formulated by David Chalmers. Materialist theories can describe brain activity in exquisite detail, but they have yet to provide a satisfying account of why these processes should be accompanied by inner experience rather than functioning in complete unconsciousness, like a highly advanced computer. Dualism, on the other hand, posits that consciousness is a separate ontological category from matter. While this view acknowledges the reality of subjective experience, it raises its own set of problems. If the mind and body are distinct, how do they interact? This dilemma, famously posed by Descartes, remains a major challenge for dualist theories. Neuroscientific advances have increasingly demonstrated the intimate dependency of consciousness on the physical brain, making it difficult to sustain the idea that mind and matter exist as entirely separate substances. Panpsychism presents itself as a middle path between these two extremes. Rather than treating consciousness as something that suddenly emerged at a certain level of biological complexity, or as something entirely separate from the physical world, panpsychism holds that consciousness is an intrinsic feature of matter itself. This means that the basic constituents of reality, perhaps fundamental particles, fields, or even space-time itself, possess some form of proto-consciousness. Though this consciousness would be unimaginably simple compared to human experience, it provides a foundation from which more complex conscious states can arise through appropriate forms of combination and organization. This perspective has been strongly influenced by the work of Bertrand Russell and Arthur Eddington in the early 20th century. Russell argued that physics, in its current form, describes only the external structure of matter, its mathematical relationships and observable behaviours, while leaving unanswered the question of what matter is in itself. According to Russellian monism, physics provides only a map of reality, not its underlying essence. Panpsychists extend this idea by suggesting that the intrinsic nature of matter is in some fundamental way experiential. This means that the fire in the equations of physics, the thing that actually exists behind the mathematical descriptions, is, in some minimal form, consciousness. One of the most provocative implications of this view is that consciousness does not emerge from complexity, but is instead woven into the fabric of existence itself. If true, this would upend the conventional materialist framework and force a radical rethinking of both science and philosophy. Yet, as promising as it may seem, panpsychism is not without its critics, who argue that it merely shifts rather than solves the fundamental problem of consciousness. One of the most persistent and challenging objections to panpsychism is the combination problem. If fundamental particles possess rudimentary forms of consciousness, how do these tiny, isolated conscious entities come together to form the unified, complex experience of a human mind? This is not merely a practical question about how consciousness might scale up, but a deep conceptual issue that threatens the coherence of the entire panpsychist framework. Unlike materialist views, which seek to explain consciousness as an emergent phenomenon of neural computation, panpsychism must account for how a multitude of individual conscious experiences merge into a single, seamless perspective. This problem was first articulated in its modern form by William James, who argued that just as individual drops of water do not combine into a single greater drop, individual conscious experiences should not simply fuse into a new, larger consciousness. If each electron or quark has a tiny spark of awareness, how do these tiny minds avoid remaining entirely separate from one another? The human mind does not feel like a collection of smaller minds working in unison. Rather, it feels like a single, unified subject. This is a major obstacle for panpsychists, who must provide a compelling explanation of how this unification occurs. One possible response comes from proponents of constitutive panpsychism, who argue that complex consciousness arises from the structural organization of simpler conscious units. According to this view, fundamental particles possess consciousness in an extremely minimal form, perhaps only the barest glimmer of awareness, and these micro-conscious states combine into larger, more complex forms of consciousness as particles organize into atoms, molecules, and ultimately neural structures. This is similar in some ways to the way that individual neurons contribute to larger cognitive processes in the brain. However, critics argue that mere structural arrangement is not sufficient to generate unified subjective experience. It remains unclear how an aggregate of distinct awarenesses could transition into a singular, seamless consciousness. Another approach is panpsychist holism, which rejects the assumption that fundamental particles possess individual conscious states in isolation. Instead, holists argue that the universe as a whole is the fundamental conscious entity, and that localized conscious experiences, such as those found in human beings, are derivative of this overarching cosmic consciousness. This idea has echoes in philosophical traditions like Spinoza's pantheism and certain strands of Eastern thought, but it raises further difficulties. If the universe itself is conscious, why do its subcomponents also need to be conscious? And how does this global consciousness interact with local minds like our own? Ultimately, the combination problem remains the most significant theoretical challenge facing panpsychism. Without a convincing resolution, panpsychism risks merely shifting the mystery of consciousness rather than solving it. Yet, despite these difficulties, the framework continues to attract interest as it promises a radically new way of understanding the place of mind in nature. Whether the combination problem proves fatal to panpsychism or leads to new breakthroughs in the philosophy of mind remains an open question. The debate over panpsychism extends beyond philosophy into the realm of empirical science. If panpsychism is true, should it not be possible to test it? Many critics argue that one of the greatest weaknesses of panpsychism is its apparent lack of falsifiability. Unlike materialist theories, which can be investigated through neuroscience and cognitive science, panpsychism posits that consciousness exists at the fundamental level of reality, a claim that on the surface seems difficult to verify experimentally. However, proponents of panpsychism argue that while direct empirical proof may be challenging, there are ways in which scientific research can support or undermine the theory. One of the most promising areas of research related to panpsychism is integrated information theory, IIT, a leading scientific approach to consciousness developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. IoT proposes that consciousness is fundamentally linked to the amount of integrated information in a system, measured by a quantity called phi. The theory suggests that systems with high phi, such as human brains, are highly conscious, while systems with low phi, such as simple machines, are minimally conscious or entirely unconscious. Some panpsychists have suggested that IIT provides an empirical framework that is compatible with their view. If even simple physical systems exhibit non-zero levels of integrated information, this could be interpreted as evidence for consciousness at a fundamental level. However, critics point out that IIT, while a rigorous and mathematically formalized theory, does not necessarily imply panpsychism. it is still possible to interpret integrated information as a purely functional property of systems without attributing consciousness to fundamental particles. Another line of empirical investigation involves studying the neural correlates of consciousness, NCCs, the specific brain structures and processes that correlate with conscious experience. If panpsychism is true, it could predict that the transition from unconscious to conscious states is more gradual than materialist theories suggest, with no sharp boundary separating conscious from non-conscious matter. Research on brain injuries, coma patients, and minimally conscious states has shown that consciousness does not always simply switch off when neural function is impaired, but instead can exist in altered or diminished forms, consistent with the idea that consciousness is more fundamental than previously thought. Quantum mechanics has also been invoked in discussions of panpsychism, although often controversially. Some interpretations of quantum theory, such as those proposed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, suggest that consciousness may be linked to quantum processes occurring at the microtubular level in neurons. While this remains highly speculative, some panpsychists see quantum indeterminacy and observer effects as potential indicators that consciousness plays a fundamental role in physical reality. Ultimately, while no definitive empirical test for panpsychism has yet been established, scientific research continues to probe the nature of consciousness. Whether panpsychism will ultimately be embraced or rejected may depend not only on philosophical arguments, but also on the extent to which future discoveries support or challenge its claims. The discussion surrounding panpsychism inevitably leads to questions of ethics, spirituality, and the broader implications of a conscious universe. If consciousness is not confined to biological organisms but instead exists at the fundamental level of reality, what does this mean for how we treat the world around us? Does panpsychism imply that all things, from trees to stars to subatomic particles, deserve a form of moral consideration? These questions push the theory beyond the realm of academic philosophy and into the domains of ethics, theology, and environmental thought. One of the most immediate ethical consequences of panpsychism is its potential impact on how we view non-human life. Many ethical traditions grant moral status to beings based on their ability to experience pain, pleasure, or a range of subjective states. If panpsychism is correct, then some form of subjective experience exists even in the simplest organisms, challenging the traditional boundary between sentient and non-sentient life. This could strengthen the philosophical foundation of environmental ethics, giving additional weight to arguments for the intrinsic value of nature. The idea that trees, rivers, or even entire ecosystems possess a form of consciousness resonates with indigenous and animist traditions, which have long regarded the natural world as alive in a way that Western thought has often dismissed as superstition. At the same time, panpsychism raises difficult theological and metaphysical questions. Some thinkers have drawn connections between panpsychism and pantheism, the view that the universe itself is divine. If consciousness is everywhere, could it imply that reality as a whole has an overarching mind akin to the world soul, concept found in Platonic and Hindu traditions? Some theologians have sought to integrate panpsychism with theism, arguing that a universe infused with consciousness could be seen as a reflection of divine immanence. However, others resist this connection, pointing out that panpsychism, strictly speaking, does not require any kind of divine intelligence, only that consciousness is a natural and intrinsic property of matter. A further challenge concerns the distinction between consciousness and life. Many modern biologists define life functionally in terms of reproduction, metabolism, and adaptation, without necessarily requiring consciousness. Panpsychism, however, suggests that consciousness may exist independently of life, meaning that even non-living entities, such as electrons or magnetic fields, may possess some form of primitive experience. This challenges the intuitive association between being alive and having a mind, leading to potential reconsiderations of the boundaries between biology, physics, and philosophy. Ultimately, the ethical and theological implications of panpsychism remain an open field of inquiry. Whether it leads to a more reverent view of nature, a reconfiguration of traditional religious beliefs, or a radical rethinking of consciousness itself, panpsychism continues to challenge many of the core assumptions that have shaped modern thought. It invites us to ask whether we are simply observers in a lifeless cosmos or participants in a universe teeming with consciousness at every level. As the philosophical debate over panpsychism continues, one of the key questions remains: what is its future? Will it eventually be accepted as a legitimate paradigm in philosophy of mind, or will it fade into the background as a speculative detour? While the theory remains controversial, its growing influence suggests that it is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Instead, panpsychism is increasingly being recognized as a serious alternative to both materialist and dualist accounts of consciousness, particularly as traditional approaches struggle to provide satisfactory answers to the hard problem of consciousness. One reason for the growing interest in panpsychism is the increasing awareness of the limitations of materialist explanations. Despite the extraordinary success of neuroscience in mapping brain functions, no scientific theory has yet explained why certain neural processes give rise to subjective experience. Even with advanced brain imaging and computational modeling, materialism has not bridged the explanatory gap between brain activity and the lived experience of consciousness. As philosopher Thomas Nagel famously argued, understanding consciousness requires more than just objective data. It requires an explanation of what it is like to be a conscious subject. Panpsychism, by proposing that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, sidesteps this problem by rejecting the assumption that consciousness emerges only in complex biological systems. Another factor contributing to the resurgence of panpsychism is the growing intersection between philosophy and physics. Quantum mechanics, with its strange observer-dependent effects and fundamental indeterminacy, has challenged classical assumptions about the nature of reality. While most physicists remain skeptical of consciousness-based interpretations of quantum theory, some researchers suggest that consciousness may play a more fundamental role in physical reality than previously assumed. If physics ultimately reveals that matter itself has intrinsic mental properties, panpsychism could gain empirical support in ways that are currently unforeseen. At the same time, panpsychism continues to face significant obstacles. The combination problem remains an unresolved issue, and unless a convincing solution is developed, critics will continue to argue that panpsychism is no more explanatory than the theories it seeks to replace. Additionally, without clear empirical criteria to test panpsychist claims, the theory risks being dismissed as unfalsifiable, a speculative hypothesis rather than a scientifically viable framework. Nevertheless, the renewed interest in panpsychism suggests that the philosophy of mind is undergoing a shift. The historical dominance of materialism is being increasingly questioned, and new approaches are being explored in both philosophy and science. Whether panpsychism ultimately proves to be a breakthrough or a passing intellectual trend remains to be seen. What is certain, however, is that the mystery of consciousness is far from solved. Until a comprehensive and satisfying explanation is found, theories like panpsychism will continue to play a crucial role in shaping the ongoing debate about the nature of mind, matter, and reality itself. Throughout history, the question of consciousness has remained one of the most elusive in philosophy and science. While materialism has long dominated the discourse, its failure to account for subjective experience has left a persistent gap in our understanding. Dualism, though acknowledging the reality of consciousness, struggles with explaining how an immaterial mind could interact with the physical body. Against this backdrop, panpsychism has re-emerged as a compelling alternative, offering a way to bridge the divide by positing that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe. This idea may seem counterintuitive at first, but upon closer examination, it addresses many of the unresolved issues in the philosophy of mind. If consciousness is not something that arises suddenly at the level of complex organisms, but is instead woven into the fabric of reality itself, then the so-called hard problem dissolves. Rather than attempting to explain how mind emerges from non-mind, panpsychism suggests that mind has always been present in some form. Just as electromagnetism and gravity are fundamental forces, consciousness may be a fundamental aspect of matter, existing in simple forms at the most basic levels of physical reality. Critics, however, argue that this framework introduces more problems than it solves. The combination problem remains one of the most significant challenges. If consciousness exists at the level of fundamental particles, how do these isolated points of awareness cohere into the unified experience of a human mind? Attempts to resolve this issue have led to various interpretations, from the idea that consciousness integrates hierarchically through complex systems to the more radical notion that the universe itself possesses a singular, overarching consciousness. While such proposals expand the philosophical landscape, they remain highly speculative, lacking empirical confirmation. Despite these challenges, interest in panpsychism continues to grow, driven in part by developments in neuroscience, quantum physics, and information theory. Some researchers see parallels between panpsychism and theories like integrated information theory, which suggests that consciousness arises from the capacity of a system to integrate information. Others point to quantum mechanics, where observer effects and the problem of measurement hint at a potential connection between consciousness and fundamental physical processes. While far from conclusive, these intersections suggest that the mystery of consciousness may be more deeply entwined with the fabric of reality than previously assumed. Whether panpsychism ultimately gains mainstream acceptance remains uncertain. However, its resurgence signals a growing dissatisfaction with conventional explanations and a willingness to entertain new possibilities. Until a more comprehensive account of consciousness emerges, the idea that mind is not an anomaly but a fundamental aspect of existence will continue to challenge and inspire thinkers across disciplines. As the exploration of panpsychism reaches its conclusion, the question remains, what does this theory ultimately tell us about reality, and where does it leave us in the ongoing quest to understand consciousness? While panpsychism challenges the traditional boundaries between mind and matter, it does not yet provide a complete or universally accepted solution. Instead, it forces us to reconsider deeply embedded assumptions about the nature of the physical world and the origins of subjective experience. Whether it represents a profound breakthrough or a sophisticated philosophical detour, its resurgence reflects a broader shift in contemporary thought, one that refuses to accept easy answers to the enigma of consciousness. One of the most striking implications of panpsychism is the possibility that consciousness is not confined to biological organisms, but is instead an intrinsic feature of the universe. If this is the case, the relationship between mind and matter may be far more complex than previously imagined, blurring the distinction between the animate and the inanimate, the physical and the mental. Some have speculated that such a view could provide a new foundation for ethical considerations, expanding our moral concern beyond sentient beings to include all of nature. Others, however, remain skeptical, arguing that without a clear account of how microconsciousness scales up to human awareness, panpsychism risks being little more than an attractive metaphysical speculation. Despite its challenges, panpsychism has proven to be more than a passing intellectual trend. The growing interest in theories of fundamental consciousness signals a broader dissatisfaction with the dominant materialist paradigm, which has struggled to explain how experience arises from matter. At the same time, panpsychism remains distinct from dualism, refusing to posit a separate realm of the mental while still acknowledging the irreducibility of subjective experience. This ability to navigate between two traditionally opposed views has made it an increasingly compelling option for those seeking a middle path in the philosophy of mind. What remains to be seen is whether future developments in science and philosophy will support or undermine panpsychism's claims. Advances in neuroscience may provide a clearer understanding of the conditions under which consciousness emerges, offering empirical tests that could challenge or reinforce panpsychist principles. Theoretical physics, too, may uncover new insights into the fundamental nature of reality, potentially revealing structures that align with panpsychist intuitions. Until then, the debate will continue, with panpsychism standing as a provocative and ambitious attempt to rethink one of humanity's greatest mysteries. Whether it ultimately succeeds or not, its enduring presence in philosophical discourse ensures that the question of consciousness will remain at the forefront of intellectual inquiry for years to come. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform